coming along to Eco Views and News. Today we want to look at a very important crisis that's starting to emerge around the world, and it's particularly reaching us in our headlines about the famine in Somalia and in neighboring Kenya and the crises that they're having in coping with this. It's obviously a very immediate crisis on hand in those countries. But behind that is a whole series of food matters, and that's what we're going to start looking at for this time, and maybe perhaps several times in the future. We've gotten our circumstance pretty confused on a global level, and food policies and food politics are a big part of the emerging famine crises that are happening in several parts of the world at this point. We hear most about the East Africa, Somalia, Kenya, and North Africa situations in many cases, but in North Korea there's a huge famine problem at this point. The head of North Korea has made a trip to Russia in particular to try to stimulate further delivery of food from Russia. And in fact, in that part of the world, food politics has become a big issue. So we're going to be looking at these issues in terms of looking at first principles and second thoughts. Second thoughts about the direction in which we're headed as a global community. And we want to start by assessing our circumstance. Now, we've been very privileged here in Cambridge for this, because over time, although we read from the New York Times that the warming planet is struggling to feed itself, there are several people who have been working on this whole issue in Cambridge for many, many decades, and there are others who've come through Cambridge to talk about it and keep us up to date on it. BBC now regularly publishes a food supply report and is suggesting that coming climate change is going to exacerbate famine problems around the world, as they say, wreak havoc on food supply. Well, people who've come through Cambridge and told us about this, like Lester Brown, have given us an indication of what's coming. Last February, in fact, he was here as part of the Cambridge Forum, and it's been rebroadcast through the Cambridge Forum, but also a new group that's come up called Food Matters. Food Matters TV, or as it's food-matters.tv, is available on the web, and you can see Lester's talk to the Cambridge Forum last February on that venue, as well as several other materials here on the left-hand side of the website. But it's important to capture what he said there last February, because it isn't just a new idea for him. He's in fact been writing and speaking on these topics the last 40 years, and you can get a sense of his global influence if you look at things published in other countries. There's a book published back in the 1990s on Changing Environmental Ideologies was the title of the book, and in fact it was put out by two Indian scholars in New Delhi. And already almost 20 years ago now, Lester Brown was reaching audiences in local publications in India on a regular basis. And he basically set up chapter 2 in this book entitled The New World Order. Now, he's continued that insight over the last 20 years, and certainly 20 before that, as head of the World Watch Institute, so it's worth looking at what he says whenever he publishes something on these topics. That chapter is available online, and you can look at it in detail because it's very far-seeing in a way. 20 years ago, he was predicting what was starting to unravel now on the daily newspapers, or you can see it in the headlines in the daily newspapers. He wrote the chapter and cited a number of very interesting sources, but he basically emphasized that few of us remain on the land. We are largely isolated from the economy's agricultural foundations. We think our economy has trouble, but we're not paying attention to the very foundations of it, the agriculture. And as he points out, we tend to take the land's capacity to satisfy our needs for granted. but maybe that's what we can't take for granted much longer. He goes on to point out that superficial economic indicators we rely on are rarely accurate. They mask the underlying serious problems. And he then, in effect, quotes a Harvard ecological anthropologist, Tim Weiskel, who, he says, quite rightly notes, we live in a highly urbanized, industrialized culture, but it is important to remember that there is no such thing as a post-agricultural society. We may think we're postmodern and post-literate and post-this and post-that, but there's no such thing as a post-agricultural society. Now, Lester emphasized this 20 years ago, citing Weiskel as an ecological anthropologist who's been saying it for just as long. In fact, he cites him in the footnote here when Weiskel was at the Harvard Divinity School, and the topic came up in a conference of religious leaders on a paper he entitled Cultural Values and Their Environmental Implications, an essay on knowledge, belief, and global survival. Now, this is very, very interesting because Lester was pointing out then, and we've emphasized since, that the agricultural system is very much a construction of our knowledge systems and our cultural beliefs. Knowledge, belief, and survival will be involved in the evolution of our agriculture. It depends upon what we do to the land to get food and what we, in effect, create as a problem in the process. We used to think of it as a simplified food problem in a way. There was a food problem in production. You just had to produce more of it, but it very quickly became a dual problem of food population. How could you produce enough food to keep ahead of a growing population seemed to be the formulation in the early 60s. And then once again, it became very apparent by the end of the 90s that this had a lot to do with the environment. And that's what we need to reassess a bit now. This schematic representation of the wild species represented by the tree here, the cultivated species represented by the grain, and the human population, these are all interrelated. We have to keep that in mind as the food population environment problem. Now much more sophisticated than just growing food. But the ratios are absolutely crucial to keep in mind. This is a representation schematically of what's happened over time from 1980 to basically the year 2000 and projected ahead to the year 2020. What happens when these ratios get out of whack? The amount of food per capita was pretty large in the 80s, but it shrunk into the year 2000. And the amount of wild species per capita was enormous. It shrunk enormously, and it's become, as a projection, even smaller in reference to the per capita size of the population. Now, the pace and magnitude of these transformations are absolutely staggering. And that's one of the things we want to reassess. This kind of thing cannot continue. It's not just an opinion here. This is just physically the case. Humans don't photosynthesize. Plants photosynthesize. So there's a ratio between the amounts that there can be of plants and that there can be of human beings. That's all there is to it. Humans basically live on, at best, the second trophic level. They ingest things that photosynthesize, or they ingest other things that eat things that photosynthesize. They can eat meat, and they can move down the food chain to eat vegetables, but it's the vegetables and the plants they come from that are capturing the solar energy. So this question of ratios really matters. And they have to be kept in mind as we go forward, because this kind of trajectory just can't continue. Naturalists have pointed this out for quite a while, talking about this in terms of the crisis of biodiversity. We're losing plants and animal species. And in fact, Richard Leakey wrote about it in such a way that he left the word looking like it was fading out here on the right. That's not just a misprint. That's his point about we're in the midst of a huge extinction on the Earth's surface. The extinction is being represented by disappearance in this major event. He counts it as the sixth. There have been 5 major extinctions due to meteor impacts and volcanism and a whole series of planetary changes in previous eras, but the sixth we're in the midst of now. And he, among others, and other scientists have joined him, for quite some time now have been talking about the biodiversity crisis. The loss or destruction or displacement of biodiversity appears to be taking place on a scale of geological extinction event. This is like the impact of a meteor. So this is occurring, but that's part of the ratio problem. We've got to get in focus. And we've got to begin to ask ourselves whether or not the planet itself is overloaded. Some have suggested so, the titles of their books. But obviously, posing the question like that raises a whole series of other questions, sometimes too embarrassing to answer in public space, so they get swept under the rug. Still others have gone on to say, listen, there are already too many people on Earth. And in effect, we're about to see the crash occur. The planet cannot sustain the current 6.6 or 6.5 billion that it has, and we're going to see in our lifetimes and perhaps in the near future a collapse of this kind of thing. Well, many people have been arguing this even from the days of Malthus, that we're up against food production constraints, but they didn't bank on the kinds of things that Norman Borlaug introduced in the 1950s and 60s. He's a very famous agricultural scientist and was funded by the Ford and Rockefeller Foundation, and his work became dubbed the Green Revolution at the time. He's referred to here as an agricultural pioneer, or agriculture pioneer. And there was an obit written for him in 2009 when he died. We'll want to look in greater detail at his contribution. It's significant over time. Tributes were given from around the world. This is one from the BBC. And we can come back and discuss them at length at some point. But his biography is very interesting because it corresponds to a particular moment in global agricultural history where the human population shifted from being a solar sustainable population, one that was based on the capture of solar energy, to becoming a fossil fuel dependent population. He did this not intentionally at the time, in the sense that his goal wasn't to make people dependent upon petroleum, but the techniques and technologies he developed increasingly committed both himself but also everyone who followed in his footsteps to increasing use of fossil fuels, to the point where the agriculture is now totally dependent on it. So as we listen to the laudatory comments about Norman Borlaug, and we'll want to listen to some, we'll have to keep in mind some of the ecological impacts that his achievements have left behind. As I say, he died in 2009, but in 2007, 2 years before his death, he was in fact honored by the Congressional Gold Medal, which he received from George Bush. He then, at the time, in an interview, underscored that the Green Revolution that he had participated in really needs to be extended to what he calls a second Green Revolution, or the Gene Revolution, the extension to genetics. He didn't actually participate in that himself to any great extent. His was based on selective breeding and the use of fertilizer and irrigation. Very successful and enormously influential around the world. But some of that's come in for criticism, and you can see why, as the assessments have been offered by ecologists looking at the global impact of that petro-intensive agriculture. Take a look.
The planet more in the last half a century than at any time in history. Vast tracts of land have been taken for modern farming. Fertilizer use has increased hugely. Forests and other ecosystems are disappearing. None of this is a surprise, but what the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment aims to do is to measure what these environmental changes mean for human progress. It concludes that in places too much water is being used for irrigation, so there's less available for drinking. Land that's farmed too intensively is becoming barren. Deforestation is increasing the risk of diseases such as malaria and cholera. The report also tries to put an economic cost on environmental degradation. In the UK, it finds farming causes around £1.5 billion worth of damage each year through impacts like greenhouse gas emissions, water pollution and soil erosion. Launched 4 years ago by UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment is one of the biggest scientific collaborations ever undertaken. More than 2,500 pages long, the report is unlikely to produce any quick-fix solutions, but it should provide the best view yet of the problem. Richard Black, BBC News.
Okay, that's Richard Black's assessment in a summary report of the Ecosystems Assessment Report, the report that was undertaken by the UN, warning about these ratios. Basically, the devastation of tropical forests, the excessive use of water in irrigation system and the runoff of pesticides in agriculture and the continuing growth of the human population has led to this huge problem of disequilibrium or imbalance. Our basic problem as a human community is that we've forgotten, and you might argue that many of our leaders never knew, the basic ecological insight about our collective niche as a species in the global ecosystem. We're dependent on those other species. We can't crowd them out and expect to survive. It won't happen. Population growth has been absolutely enormous in the recent period. In fact, it's been referred to as a population bomb for a reason. I mean, look at the trajectory here. This is just extraordinary. In my lifetime alone, the human population has tripled. And that can be said to be absolutely exceptional in human history in the sense that it never happened before and it will never happen again. That will never happen in one person's lifetime, a tripling of the world's population. It happened in the lifetimes of people living in the mid to the late 20th century. But if we triple again, we'll exceed the carrying capacity of the Earth. That's never going to happen. The die-off is going to be massive before that begins to happen. And the reason why that is that we're beginning to see a couple of things in conjunction with each other. Basically, we've gotten to the point where we're going to peak out on the amount of oil that we can extract. Population is continuing to grow, and the heat being trapped by greenhouse gases is building up. So there's actually a conjuncture here with three different problems. It's no longer just a food problem. Food contributes to the growing population, but the food is increasingly dependent upon petroleum. So when you run out of petroleum or it becomes scarce, that population is going to crash shortly thereafter, especially if it has to deal with, as we're beginning to find out, the global impact of a warming population, when in fact agriculture can have quite a bit of difficulty, and will probably. This has led some people to think about doomsday scenarios, and the History Channel has actually put some of this out that's worth taking a look at. It's pretty sobering material. Take a look.
The truth is that sometime in the next half century, we're going to start to run out of oil. The pessimists say 15 years, the optimists say 40 years. So that's the range. It's not 500 years, it's a couple of decades.
We're going to peak in 2010 to 2020, as the pessimists say, or will we peak in oil production between 2030 and 2040, as the optimists say? And it hit me one day, it doesn't make a hell of a big difference. They're only arguing about 20 years.
It will be many decades, perhaps a century, before the world actually runs out of oil. But cheap oil will get harder to come by much sooner, as we approach what oil geologists call peak production, when half of the world's recoverable oil has been extracted. At that point, the theory goes, the price of oil will explode as awareness of scarcity kicks in. The magnitude of this comes from the simple fact that the modern world is not just utterly dependent on oil. It's dependent on cheap oil, and lots of it.
When anthropologists look back at this period in history, they'll call it the oil age, because the whole world revolves around the use of oil. It's not just the gasoline we put in the automobile for transport. Our food is grown in petrochemical fertilizers. Many of our pharmaceutical products are petrochemical based. Our packaging material, our plastics, it's all petrochemical. Transport, power, heat, light. We really do rely on oil for every aspect of our life.
The mid-20th century's green revolution in agriculture, which dramatically increased crop yields worldwide, was largely made possible by two breakthrough technologies: mechanization and petrochemical fertilizers. Both depend on cheap oil. Today, food for many of the world's 6 billion people depends on this equation.
The year 2019.
Now, here is where the projection takes over. What they've done up to now is basically explain how we've become dependent on petroleum, especially our agriculture. But what they do now is say, well, if this trend continues, what's going to happen? And here they run this scenario, the year 2019. It's pretty interesting as an exercise. Don't take it as truth yet, because it's in the if-then category. It's conditional. It's saying if things continue as they are headed, then this is one of the things that could happen. Now, that kind of if-then is important to keep in mind. It's not a prediction. It's a conditional statement. It hopes to falsify itself. It would falsify itself if people say, hey, wait a minute, we can't let it do that. But it's based on an old Chinese proverb, which, you know, it would be good to remember. Namely, if you don't change direction, you're likely to end up where you're headed. Let's see where they see we're headed here. It's pretty staggering. 2019.
The price of oil, $425 a barrel. A global depression sets in. Huge parts of the developing world stagger from the one-two punch of financial collapse and global warming-related natural disasters.
The countries that simply can't afford an energy source at that price will become much more disadvantaged. So there's separation between the haves and the have-nots to an extent that it's even greater than it is now. The result of that is conflict.
Today, the oil economy is already submitting to the law of diminishing returns.
The United States government now spends more money maintaining a military presence in the Persian Gulf than the net value of the oil it's getting from the Persian Gulf, and that was before the war. That was $200 billion ago.
If the
That was before the Iraq War, $200 billion ago, before the Afghan War as well. I mean, we've spent ourselves into a hole here to try to extract and control oil, which we've become more and more dependent on, at the same time that our agriculture has become totally dependent on it. Makes us more and more desperate to acquire it, and we're actually spending more in trying to get that energy than we're getting back. That's an energy sink, and it's suicidal. In the long run, it'll be suicidal because our agriculture won't be able to perform under these circumstances. It's pretty staggering when you think what the implications of that are. They actually go into this themselves and take a look.
Welcome to the year 2034. 20-year droughts from the western U.S. to Asia's Mekong Delta have threatened world food supplies. Year after year of hurricanes have destroyed the economy of the southeastern U.S. and left New Orleans permanently underwater. Famine kills millions in northern Africa. Surging sea levels devastate Bangladesh.
Okay, now you can get the idea here. This is not pretty, and it's not going to be very calm a transition by any means. So we'll need to keep an eye on these things as we start to reassess these food matters. especially as we've gotten more and more of our production dependent upon something we know we're running out of. Keep in touch. We'll keep you posted on Food Matters, and you can now go to food-matters.tv to find out more about this. Thank you very much.